morning when the CEO, disguised in plain clothes, stepped into his own company's office. He wasn't the man people admired or feared today. Today, he was just another worker, one of many anonymous faces. His heart raced with anticipation, but his face betrayed nothing. He had decided to go undercover, to witness firsthand what his employees were really like when they thought no one important was watching. The air inside the building buzzed with the usual sounds of ringing phones, clicking keyboards, and hurried footsteps. No one seemed to notice the stranger who entered through the back door. A low-level worker, dressed in a uniform that barely fit, walked in with a fake ID. His plan was simple: blend in, gather information, and leave without anyone suspecting the truth. It wasn't long before he realized just how much he had underestimated the situation. He had come to observe, to see the inner workings of his company from the ground up, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. He was assigned to work under a manager who, at first, seemed professional. But as the day went on, he noticed things that made his stomach churn. The manager was rude to the staff, belittling them in front of others, using harsh words that made everyone uncomfortable. As the CEO listened, he could feel his fists clenching. This wasn't just the occasional bad mood. It was a toxic environment, one where cruelty and disregard for others were not only tolerated but encouraged. The real shock came when the manager, unaware of the stranger's true identity, started discussing business practices in an offhand manner. It was a conversation that left the CEO frozen. The manager bragged about cutting corners, ignoring safety protocols, and manipulating data to increase company profits. As the words spilled out, it was clear to the CEO that this was only a small glimpse into a much darker world. The manager's voice dropped as he spoke of the company's clients, casually describing how they were often overcharged for subpar services, and how a few key employees were in on it. The CEO's heart sank as he absorbed the full extent of what was going on. His employees weren't just ignoring the rules, they were actively participating in illegal activities that could destroy everything he had worked for. He had expected to find a few minor issues, some lazy workers, perhaps a bit of inefficiency. But this was betrayal. It was the kind of thing that could bring down an empire, one rotten piece at a time. The CEO felt the weight of his decision. He had started this undercover mission with the intention of finding out what needed fixing, but now he was faced with something much larger than he had anticipated. There were bigger problems here, ones that went beyond a few bad apples. This was a company built on deceit, manipulation, and corruption. As the day ended, the CEO walked out of the building, his mind racing. He had seen the darkness that lurked behind the scenes, and now he had to figure out what to do with this newfound knowledge. The stakes were higher than he ever imagined, and the decisions ahead would change everything. What he did next would determine the fate of his company and everyone in it. But for now, all he could do was think, plan, and prepare for the next step in this dangerous game. The next day, the CEO returned to the office, his mind still heavy from what he had witnessed. But now, he had a new purpose. He couldn't just walk away, knowing the truth. His mission had changed. What he had thought would be a simple investigation had now become a battle against a corrupt system. As he entered the building again, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The employees went about their business, oblivious to the fact that the man they'd been mistreating and underestimating was the very person who owned the company. The CEO felt an overwhelming sense of detachment. He was no longer a leader. He was a mere observer, silently watching everything unfold. He was assigned to a new team today, one that seemed to have a bit more respect, but as the hours passed, the cracks began to show. It wasn't just the bad managers or the dishonest employees, it was everyone. From the janitor to the high-ranking executives, there was an underlying feeling of entitlement, greed, and carelessness that permeated the building. Each interaction was tainted with a sense of disconnection from the company's true values. It started with a conversation in the break room. A group of employees was gathered, talking casually about the latest project. At first, it seemed innocent enough, but then one employee, with a grin that sent a chill down the CEO's spine, casually mentioned how they had forged approval on documents to expedite a project. They spoke openly about using their positions for personal gain, securing deals for themselves without any regard for the company's reputation. The CEO's heart pounded in his chest. He had been told that the company's culture was one of collaboration and hard work, but now it was clear that the reality was far different. The employees had grown so comfortable in their corruption that they saw no problem in boasting about it to anyone who would listen. The CEO felt his anger bubbling up, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had to stay undercover for now. Revealing himself would be catastrophic, not just for him but for the entire company. Later that afternoon, a high-ranking executive entered the break room. The CEO had known this man for years and had always regarded him as one of the company's pillars. But now, seeing him in action, the CEO couldn't help but notice the arrogance in his posture. The executive casually made a comment about the latest round of layoffs, how they could have been avoided, but the company had to save face with investors. He spoke of the employees who had been let go with such indifference, as though they were mere numbers, easily replaced. But what was even more alarming was how the executive spoke of the company's future. He mentioned that the company was in deep financial trouble, but he was confident that no one would ever find out. The executives had made a plan to cover it up, using the profits from illegal side deals to keep the illusion of success alive. The CEO felt a wave of disgust wash over him. The lies were deeper than he could have imagined. And yet, in this moment, he realized something important. The employees weren't just selfish, they were scared. They were trapped in a system that valued profit over integrity, and they were doing whatever they could to survive. The CEO began to see things in a new light. The power wasn't just in the hands of the executives, it was in the hands of those who believed in the company's ideals, who still cared about the work they did. As the day ended and the CEO walked out of the office, he knew his next steps were critical. He had gathered enough information to understand the depths of the corruption, but it wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. He needed to find a way to fix the damage, to restore trust, and to lead the company back to its core values. The employees were clearly stuck in a cycle of fear and greed, but was there hope for them? The CEO's mind raced with possibilities, trying to figure out who could be trusted and who needed to be exposed. But there was one thing he was certain of. He couldn't do it alone. It would take a team of real leaders to make the changes necessary. He had to find a way to break through the barriers, to show the employees that they were worth more than the short-term gains they were chasing. But how could he convince them to change their ways? Would they even believe that the company could return to its ethical roots? As the CEO prepared for another day of undercover work, he made a vow to himself: no matter the cost, he would bring change. He would be the one to lead them out of the darkness, even if it meant facing the truth about the very company he had built. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more betrayals, more challenges, and more twists. But for the first time since he began this mission, the CEO felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for the company's survival, he was fighting for its soul. The next few days were a blur of frustration and deep reflection. The CEO continued his undercover mission, each day revealing more disturbing truths about his company. His faith in the people he had once trusted was starting to crumble. The more he saw, the clearer it became: the corruption had spread much deeper than he had imagined. The atmosphere at work was tense. The CEO found himself facing small moments of kindness from certain employees, people who seemed unaware of the dark undercurrents around them. These brief moments of decency were bittersweet. It reminded him that not everyone was a part of the problem. In fact, there were still a handful of employees who genuinely cared about the company, who were willing to work hard and do the right thing. But the rest were lost, trapped in a cycle of greed and ambition. During lunch one afternoon, he overheard two employees discussing the next big project, but their conversation quickly turned to manipulation. One of them was boasting about using connections to secure a major contract, skimming a percentage off the top for themselves. The other employee, clearly impressed, nodded in agreement, as if this was just how things were done. They didn't see anything wrong with it. The CEO's heart sank as he listened. It was a reminder that the company's culture had been poisoned by the very people at the top. Those who had started out with good intentions had either been corrupted or forced into silence. But amidst all the deceit, there were small sparks of hope. One employee, a quiet young woman who had joined the company only a year ago, had begun to stand out. She worked diligently, always looking for ways to improve her work and help others. The CEO had noticed her on several occasions, going above and beyond to ensure that clients received the best service, even when no one was watching. He began to keep a closer eye on her, intrigued by her integrity. She didn't seem to be affected by the toxic atmosphere around her. Instead, she appeared determined to carve out a space for herself where doing the right thing mattered more than personal gain. The CEO wondered, could she be the key to turning things around? One evening, when everyone had left the office, the CEO approached her desk. She was still there, working late, her face lit by the glow of her computer screen. He stepped forward, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He had to make a choice, reveal who he truly was and risk everything, or continue hiding and gather more information. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but cautious. She looked up, startled. "Oh, I didn't expect anyone to be here at this hour." The CEO smiled, trying to keep his voice casual. "I've been meaning to ask you about the last project you worked on. I noticed the extra effort you put in." She blinked, confused by the compliment. "Thank you, sir. I just try to make sure everything is done right." The CEO could feel the sincerity in her words. It was genuine. "You're one of the few who still care," he said quietly. "I admire that." Her eyes widened, and she seemed unsure of how to respond. She had probably never heard a compliment like that before, not in this environment. "I just do my job," she said, almost apologetically. The CEO paused, his mind racing. Here was someone who could make a difference, someone who could help him change the company from the inside out. He had to find a way to make her understand what was really happening, to bring her on his side before things got worse. "I know this might be strange," he began, lowering his voice, "but I need to ask you something. Do you know what's really going on here?" Her expression shifted. She looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. "I've heard rumors," she said, "but I didn't want to believe them. It's not easy to see." The CEO took a deep breath. He needed to be careful. "What if I told you the company's in serious trouble? What if I told you that the people you think you can trust aren't who they seem?" Her eyes widened in shock, but she said nothing. "I'm not just the guy in charge here," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm the CEO. And I've been watching. I know what's going on, and I need your help." Her face paled as the realization hit her. She was standing in front of the very person she had always heard about but never imagined she'd meet. But instead of fear, something else flickered in her eyes, curiosity. "I don't know what I can do," she said quietly. "You can be the voice of change," he said. "If we work together, we can fix this. But it's going to take courage." She hesitated, clearly weighing her options. The CEO could see the internal struggle in her eyes. He had no idea what her decision would be, but one thing was certain: the fate of the company now rested on the shoulders of a few people who still believed in doing what was right. The decision had been made. The young woman, despite her initial hesitation, agreed to help the CEO. She understood the gravity of the situation now. The CEO had confided in her, revealing not just the issues with the employees but the financial instability the company was facing, all due to corruption and unethical practices. She knew that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The CEO had already been collecting evidence in secret, but now he had an ally, someone who could provide him with insights from within. Over the next few days, they began to work quietly together, compiling the details of fraudulent contracts, manipulated financial reports, and even instances of employees covering up criminal behavior. It was a delicate process. If anyone found out about their collaboration, it would jeopardize everything. But despite the risks, the young woman's determination fueled the CEO's resolve. He had underestimated her. She wasn't just a cog in the machine. She was a person who cared deeply about her work, and more importantly, about doing the right thing. Her quiet rebellion against the culture around her was becoming more evident with each passing day. One afternoon, they found a piece of information that sent a chill down their spines. A series of emails from a senior executive to a supplier revealed a plot to inflate invoices and embezzle money, siphoning funds directly from the company's most lucrative project. The scale of the operation was shocking. If it was exposed, it could ruin the company's reputation, leaving thousands of employees without jobs. The CEO's instincts told him that the moment they revealed this, it would be the beginning of the end for many of the top executives. As they continued digging, they uncovered something even more unsettling: the involvement of some of the CEO's closest advisors. People he had trusted for years. These were individuals who had been feeding him information, helping him make decisions based on a twisted version of the truth. Their betrayal was personal. The weight of the discovery hit him harder than he had expected. These were people who had once stood beside him, built the company from the ground up. How could they have turned so far down the wrong path? It wasn't just about money or power, it was about their complete disregard for the values they once held. The CEO shared his frustrations with the young woman, his voice tinged with anger and disappointment. "I don't know who I can trust anymore. Everyone has been lying. Every decision I've made, every move I've made, has been based on lies. And now, I don't know how to fix it." She looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "But you're trying. That's what matters. You're doing something about it." Her words were simple, but they cut through the CEO's turmoil like a sharp knife. She was right. Despite everything, he was still trying to fix it. He hadn't given up yet. The fight wasn't over. But even with her support, he knew that the road ahead was dangerous. The moment they exposed the corruption, everything would change. The employees who were involved would fight back, and the executives who had been living in their world of deceit would do everything they could to keep their secrets buried. It was clear now, the CEO wasn't just fighting for the company's survival. He was fighting for the truth. And he couldn't do it alone. Late that night, as they sat in the CEO's office, sifting through the final pieces of the puzzle, the door suddenly opened. The CEO froze. A familiar face stepped inside, one of the executives he had trusted the most. "What are you two doing in here?" the executive asked, his tone cold but curious. The CEO's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't let it show. "Just finishing up some paperwork," he said, trying to sound casual. But the executive wasn't fooled. His eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, his gaze darting between the CEO and the young woman. "Something doesn't feel right," he muttered. "You've been acting strange lately. You're not planning on making trouble, are you?" The tension in the room was palpable. The CEO knew this was it, the moment when everything could come crashing down. His hands gripped the desk, his mind racing. Was this the beginning of the end? Or could he turn the tables and expose the corruption before it was too late? The executive took another step forward, his suspicion growing. But the CEO wasn't going to back down now. He had come too far. He wasn't going to let fear control him. With a steady voice, he met the executive's gaze. "I'm just getting started." The air in the room was thick with tension as the CEO and the executive stared at each other. The young woman, sensing the danger, stood up slowly, her eyes darting between the two men. She could feel the weight of the moment. One wrong move, and everything they had worked for would collapse. The executive's suspicion was clear, but the CEO knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't afford to let this confrontation escalate. His mind raced for a way out, but for once, it wasn't about making an excuse or hiding behind words. It was about standing tall, facing the truth, and taking control of the situation. The CEO stood up, locking eyes with the executive. "You've been running the company on lies and deceit for far too long," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It's time for everything to come to light. The truth has been buried long enough." The executive's face twisted in disbelief. "What are you talking about? You don't have proof of anything. Do you really think you can bring this down on your own?" The CEO knew the executive's bravado was nothing but a mask. Inside, the man was terrified. He had been living in the shadows for so long that the mere suggestion of exposure had rattled him. The CEO could see it in his eyes: fear, desperation, and the instinct to protect himself at all costs. "I have more than enough proof," the CEO replied, his tone unwavering. "I know what you've been doing behind closed doors. The manipulation, the falsified records, the illegal deals. It's all in black and white now." The young woman stepped forward, her voice low but determined. "We've seen everything. The emails, the contracts, the transactions. We know exactly who's involved." The executive's eyes flickered between them, panic creeping into his expression. "You don't know what you're doing. You can't take down all of us. You think you've uncovered it all, but you haven't even scratched the surface. The company is mine as much as it is yours." The CEO's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore, it was a battle for control of the company. The executive was right about one thing: the CEO couldn't do this alone. But he didn't have to. "I'm not doing this alone," the CEO said, taking a step forward. "I've got people who believe in what this company used to be. People who still care about the work we do and the values we've lost. We're not going to let you run this place into the ground." The executive sneered. "You really think a few loyal employees are going to stop me? I have more power than you can even imagine." For a moment, the room was silent. The CEO's mind raced, calculating his next move. He needed to buy time, to make sure the evidence they had gathered would reach the right people. They couldn't do this on their own. They needed allies, people in key positions who were still loyal to the company's original vision. The young woman looked at him, and in that brief glance, the CEO knew what they had to do. They couldn't expose everything at once. They needed to take out the executives one by one, carefully dismantling their network without alerting them to the full extent of their plans. The CEO nodded subtly, and she understood. "We'll take this to the board," she said firmly, her eyes never leaving the executive. "We'll let them know what you've been doing. And we'll make sure you pay for what you've done." The executive's face turned white. He had underestimated them. He had thought that the CEO, once revealed, would be an easy target. But he had forgotten one crucial thing: the CEO wasn't just an executive anymore. He was the heart of the company. And he was willing to fight for it. "You can't touch me," the executive hissed, taking a step back. "You're nothing without this company. You'll destroy it, and then where will you be?" The CEO's eyes narrowed. "I'll be standing right here, leading the people who still believe in it. People like her," he gestured to the young woman. "And we'll rebuild." The executive turned to leave, his pride shattered, but not before one last warning: "This isn't over." As the door slammed shut behind him, the CEO let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. it was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. "Are you sure about this?" the young woman asked, her voice barely a whisper. "This will change everything." The CEO nodded, his gaze determined. "Yes. It's the only way to save this company. We have to expose everything, no matter the cost." The CEO knew the road ahead was going to be difficult. The executives weren't just going to give up their power without a fight. But now, he had a team, an ally who believed in the truth, and more importantly, he had the courage to face whatever came next. The days following their confrontation with the executive were a blur of quiet meetings and hushed conversations. The CEO, now more determined than ever, began to put his plan into motion. He knew that if they were going to expose the corruption, they couldn't afford any more slip-ups. Every step had to be calculated, every move had to be precise. The CEO and the young woman worked in secret, contacting a few trusted employees who had been with the company for years. These were people who still believed in the mission of the company, people who had stayed despite the growing toxicity. They gathered in the back room of the office, away from the prying eyes of the corrupt executives. In hushed voices, they discussed the strategy, how to gather more concrete evidence, how to protect themselves from the inevitable backlash, and how to get their story to the people who could make a real difference. But as the CEO sat in that room, listening to the plans unfold, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what he was about to do. Exposing everything would be dangerous, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The company was built on a reputation that had taken years to establish, and one wrong move could bring it all crashing down. He was no longer just fighting for the truth, he was fighting for the future of the company. For the employees who still believed in what they did. For the loyal ones who had no idea how deep the corruption ran. He had to do this, for them. But as the plan started to solidify, the CEO began to notice something strange. The walls around him, once supportive and familiar, began to feel like they were closing in. He had always been in control, he had built this empire from the ground up, after all. But now, as the layers of lies were peeled away, he felt more like a spectator in his own story. The longer he stayed undercover, the more he realized that he was losing touch with the very essence of what made the company successful. The employees weren't just numbers or workers to be managed, they were people. Real people, with families, dreams, and struggles. And in his pursuit of justice, the CEO was beginning to wonder if he was risking more than he realized. Was he sacrificing the very thing that made the company great? One night, while reviewing the evidence, he paused. The young woman, who had become his closest ally, noticed the change in his demeanor. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft but concerned. The CEO glanced up at her, his eyes tired. "I'm not sure anymore. It feels like we're crossing a line. What if we destroy everything we've worked for?" She walked over to him, sitting down beside him. "You're not destroying it. You're saving it. If we don't stop this now, the company will fall apart anyway. This is the only way." Her words brought him some comfort, but the doubt still lingered. Could he really trust that this was the right path? He had been so certain about what needed to be done just a few days ago. Now, with the weight of the evidence and the stakes so high, he wasn't so sure. It wasn't just the company he was worried about, it was the people. Exposing the corruption would mean exposing the lives of everyone who had been involved, and some of them were good people who had simply fallen into the wrong system. He wasn't just going after criminals, he was going after friends, mentors, people who had helped him build everything he had. And yet, the deeper they went into the investigation, the more he realized that there were no easy answers. The employees who had been part of the corruption wouldn't just go quietly, they would fight tooth and nail to keep their secrets hidden. The battle was going to get uglier, and the CEO had no illusions about the risks. But he had to continue. For the sake of the company, for the people who still believed in it, he had to see this through. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. Later that week, as they prepared to take the next step, the CEO received a call from someone he hadn't expected, one of his closest advisors. The voice on the other end was shaky, uncertain. "I know what you've been doing," the advisor said, his tone a mixture of fear and anger. "You need to stop. This is bigger than you think. You have no idea what you're dealing with." The CEO's blood ran cold. He had been expecting resistance from the corrupt executives, but this was different. This was a direct threat, someone who knew about their plan and was trying to stop it before it gained any momentum. "I'm not stopping," the CEO replied, his voice firm. "You can't scare me off. The truth will come out, whether you like it or not." The line went dead, and the CEO sat there in silence. It was clear now that they weren't just up against a few rogue employees. There were powerful forces working behind the scenes, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. As the CEO hung up the phone, he knew that the fight was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The following days were filled with constant tension. The threat from the advisor had shaken the CEO more than he had let on. It wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore, it was about survival. If his enemies had caught wind of his plans, it meant they were preparing to strike back. The CEO had underestimated how deeply embedded the corruption had become in the company. They weren't just fighting for their jobs, they were fighting to keep their secrets buried. Despite the mounting pressure, the CEO remained focused. With the young woman's help, they had continued gathering irrefutable evidence. Every document, every email, every conversation they recorded was another piece of the puzzle. The plan was to present everything to the board. But they knew that doing so would be dangerous. The board members, most of whom were involved in the corruption, would likely try to cover up everything to protect themselves. But the CEO wasn't backing down. This was bigger than just him or the company, it was about doing what was right. He couldn't let the lies continue. If he didn't expose the corruption now, the company would never recover. As the CEO sat in his office late one night, poring over the evidence one final time, the door creaked open. It was the young woman. She had a worried look on her face. "Something's wrong," she said quietly. "I think they're planning to make a move. We need to act fast." The CEO's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I overheard a conversation. Some of the higher-ups know about what we've been doing. They're already preparing to fire anyone who's been helping you. They'll do whatever it takes to shut this down." The CEO leaned back in his chair, staring at the stack of documents in front of him. He knew this was coming, he had been prepared for the fallout. But hearing it from her made it feel all too real. They were running out of time. "There's no going back now," he said, his voice hardening. "We expose them tomorrow. We take everything to the board, and we make sure the truth comes out." The young woman nodded. "I'll make sure everything's ready. But you need to be careful. They won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to protect themselves." The CEO stood up, determination in his eyes. "I'm not afraid anymore. It's time to end this." The next day, everything changed. The CEO walked into the boardroom, his heart pounding, but his resolve stronger than ever. He knew this could very well be the last time he stepped foot in this room as the CEO, but he also knew it was the only way to save the company. The board members, most of whom had been part of the corrupt network, looked at him with mixed expressions of suspicion and disdain. The air was thick with tension. The CEO didn't waste time. He placed the stack of evidence in front of the board members. "This is what's been happening in your company. Lies, embezzlement, illegal contracts, and corruption. Everything you've built is a house of cards, and it's about to come crashing down." The room was silent. The CEO's words hung in the air like a bomb ready to explode. One of the board members, the one who had been the most involved in the corruption, stood up, his face red with anger. "You're making a mistake, trying to take us down. You have no idea what you're doing. The company will fall apart if you expose this." The CEO's voice was calm but unwavering. "The company is already falling apart because of you. It's time for the truth." The board member's expression faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. "Do you really think you can just walk in here and turn everything upside down? You don't have the power to stop us." The CEO locked eyes with him. "I don't need power. I have the truth. And that's more than enough." The tension in the room was unbearable. The CEO could see the fear in the eyes of some of the other board members. They knew he was right. But they were too deep in the lies to back out now. The CEO had exposed them, and there was no turning back. "We have the evidence to take this public," the CEO continued. "We'll go to the press, to the authorities. And then the world will see exactly what kind of company you've been running." The room erupted into chaos. Some of the board members began shouting, others scrambling to defend themselves. But the CEO stood tall, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the leader of the corrupt network. He had won. The truth had won. As the shouting died down and the room fell silent once more, the CEO knew the fight wasn't over. There would be legal battles, media scrutiny, and personal attacks. But he had one thing on his side, the truth. And now, there was no escaping it. The corrupt executives who had once controlled the company were outed, one by one. The CEO's actions sparked a chain reaction that changed the entire company's structure. New leaders emerged from the ashes, people who were dedicated to rebuilding the company with integrity and honor. But the battle had come at a cost. The CEO's personal relationships with some of his closest allies were shattered. The company's reputation had been severely damaged. But in the end, the CEO learned a valuable lesson: sometimes, the hardest path is the one that leads to the greatest transformation. The aftermath of the board meeting was far more intense than the CEO had anticipated. As the dust settled, it became clear that the fight wasn't over. While the corrupt executives were ousted, their loyal followers remained in the company, and the public's perception was still shaken. Legal battles loomed on the horizon, and the media had picked up the story, amplifying the drama. The CEO couldn't afford to relax. Every day felt like a new challenge. Employees were uncertain about the future, unsure whether they could trust the new leadership. Some were skeptical of the changes, wondering if the company could ever truly recover from the corruption that had plagued it for so long. Others were just afraid of being caught in the crossfire, afraid of losing their jobs in the transition. The CEO spent sleepless nights strategizing with the new leadership team, working on damage control and trying to rebuild trust among the employees. They held town hall meetings, where the CEO addressed the entire company, acknowledging the mistakes of the past and promising to restore the company's integrity. He knew the road to redemption would be long, but he was ready to take the first step. "I know many of you are worried about what's to come," the CEO said in one of the meetings, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I'm here to tell you that we are going to make this right. We are going to rebuild this company, brick by brick. We will restore the values that made us great in the first place." The room was silent as employees listened, many of them looking to the CEO for answers. Some were hopeful, while others were still doubtful. But the CEO could see the flicker of trust in their eyes. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. It wasn't just about fixing the company's financials or putting out fires, it was about rebuilding the culture. The culture of trust, respect, and integrity had to be restored from the ground up. In the weeks that followed, the CEO worked tirelessly to make good on his promises. He implemented new ethical guidelines, created an anonymous whistleblower system, and established stricter oversight for all levels of the company. The young woman, who had been by his side throughout the journey, became a key part of the transformation. She had a vision for the company that aligned with the CEO's, and together, they started laying the groundwork for a new future. But the journey wasn't without its setbacks. Former executives who had been exposed attempted to discredit the new leadership, spreading rumors and planting doubt in the minds of the employees. Legal challenges dragged on, threatening to drain the company's resources. It seemed like every corner the CEO turned, there was another obstacle waiting. One night, as the CEO sat in his office, exhausted and worn from the endless battles, he received a call. It was from one of the board members who had sided with him during the expose. His voice was calm, but the news he shared was anything but reassuring. The legal team says we have a good chance of winning the case, but the media's been relentless. People are starting to question whether the company can ever be what it once was. There's a lot of pressure on you to step down. Some are saying it's time for a new face at the top. The CEO sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The pressure was mounting, and the weight of responsibility felt heavier with every passing day. But he had come this far. He couldn't give up now. Let them question, the CEO replied, his voice firm. We'll show them with our actions. We'll make this company stronger than ever. But in the quiet of his office, after hanging up the phone, the CEO allowed himself a moment of doubt. Was he truly capable of turning the company around? Had he made the right choices, or had his decisions caused irreversible damage? Then he thought of the employees who had stuck by him, of the young woman who had believed in him when no one else did. He thought of the loyal workers who wanted to see the company thrive again. And he knew he couldn't back down. They needed him. He wasn't just fighting for the company anymore, he was fighting for the people. The ones who had worked hard, the ones who believed in the company's values, and the ones who still believed that things could be better. The CEO stood up from his desk and walked to the window. The city skyline stretched out before him, a reminder of the challenges ahead. But it also symbolized the endless possibilities. There was still hope for the company, for the people who trusted him. He had a long road ahead, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. He had made mistakes. He had trusted the wrong people. But he had learned. And now, it was time to rebuild. Months passed, and the transformation within the company began to take root. The journey was long, and the challenges were far from over, but the CEO could feel the tide beginning to shift. The once toxic culture had begun to change, and employees who had once been skeptical started to see the results of the new leadership. Trust was being rebuilt, slowly but surely. The CEO's tireless efforts to restore integrity had not gone unnoticed. Employees who had once been wary began to speak out, sharing their thoughts and ideas for improvement. The whistleblower system worked as intended, with more employees coming forward to report concerns or share suggestions for how to make the company better. The company was becoming a place where honesty and respect were valued once again, and it was clear to the CEO that the new culture was starting to take shape. However, the scars of the past still lingered. The legal battles were far from over, and the public's perception of the company remained a work in progress. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the CEO questioned whether he had done enough. But with every step forward, with every small victory, he realized that the process was a marathon, not a sprint. One afternoon, as the CEO sat in his office, reviewing progress reports, the young woman entered the room. She had been with him from the very beginning, helping him navigate the treacherous waters of corporate corruption and guiding him as they began to rebuild the company. She had become not just a trusted ally but a friend, someone who had shared in the hardships and triumphs along the way. "We've made progress," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But there's still so much work to do." The CEO nodded, reflecting on the road they had traveled. "I know. But we've come a long way, haven't we?" She smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "We have. And I think the company is starting to believe in us again." The CEO's heart swelled with pride. It hadn't been easy, and there were still countless obstacles to overcome. But he had learned something valuable throughout this journey: change didn't happen overnight. It required patience, determination, and the willingness to do what was right, even when the world seemed to be against you. As the young woman left the office, the CEO sat back in his chair, staring out the window. The company was no longer just a business, it had become a symbol of transformation. It had been through the darkest times, and now, it was on the path to redemption. But the CEO knew one thing for sure: he couldn't have done it alone. It was the people, the ones who had stood by him, who had believed in the company's true values, that made the difference. He had learned to trust his instincts, to lead with integrity, and most importantly, to never give up. He had made mistakes. He had trusted the wrong people. But in the end, it was those mistakes that taught him the most valuable lesson of all: sometimes, you have to go through the hardest trials to come out stronger on the other side. The company was on the mend, and it would take time to fully recover from the damage. But the CEO had learned that in order to lead, you first had to understand the human cost of your decisions. The real power in a company wasn't in the balance sheet or the profits, it was in the people who worked there, the ones who believed in its mission and were willing to fight for it. As the CEO looked out at the city skyline once more, he knew that the path ahead would still be difficult. But he was ready. And this time, he was not walking alone. The company was no longer defined by its past mistakes, it was defined by the people who had the courage to change, to rebuild, and to rise above. The lesson was clear: true leadership is not about power, it's about integrity, resilience, and the willingness to do what's right, even when it seems impossible.